In this demo, we are going to create a decorative seam called the slot seam. All right. So for this, I have my two panels, or two different sides of the garment that will make up the seam, and I have a 2-inch wide bias strip cut. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to sew together our two pieces of fabric. You'll notice I have the right side marked with these lines, and then the wrong side there's nothing. So let's go to the sewing machine and go ahead and sew these together. All right, and we're just going to use a regular seam for that. Okay, we're at the machine now. I'm going to go ahead and put right sides together here of my fabric, lining up the two cut edges. And I'm just going to sew a 1/2-inch seam allowance. You could do a larger seam allowance if you needed to, if you need to do 3/4 or 5/8 or an inch, whatever it is. But in this case, I think a 1/2 inch will be fine. So we're going to sew this. We're going to, there we go. All right. And I'm going to lengthen my stitch because this seam is going to be taken out eventually. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and lengthen my stitches to make it easier stitches to take out. And we'll go ahead and stitch this. We don't need the back tack at the beginning and end because, again, this row of stitching will be taken out. There we go. I've gone ahead and stitched my seam. So let's go to the iron and press this seam allowance open. I'm also going to switch my stitch length back to my construction stitch. Okay, we're going to press this seam open now. So I'm going to open that up and we'll just give it a quick press. There we go. Pressed it open. So there's our seam pressed open. Looks good. So now what we need to do is we need to sew our bias onto the back of the seam. Okay. So again, I've cut myself a 2-inch wide bias strip. It could be smaller than this. If you want a reminder of how to find and cut bias, there's a link in the comment section below. You can click on that. I have a video describing how to find and cut bias strips. All right, so what I'm going to do, again, this is the wrong side of my fabric. So here's my garment. Here's the right side. There's my clean finished, or there's my seam. Here's the wrong side. Here's my seam allowance. I'm going to now take my bias strip and I'm going to lay it right over the top so it's centered right on that seam allowance. Okay, so if I fold it back, you can see what it looks like. So I'm just centering that right over the top, like so. And then I'm just going to throw a couple pins in to hold it in place. Now, you don't necessarily need to use a bias strip for this. You could use ribbon or something like that as well. But you will find that bias sews on a lot nicer. And there's less chance of it pulling or roping or puckering. So whenever you can, you really do want to use bias. Okay? So I've pinned it on. You can see my pins coming through. I'm actually going to switch those pins to the right side so that I can pull them out as I stitch. And again, this is just to hold that piece of bias in place as I sew it on. I'm just pinning through all layers. There we go. Okay, so now what we want to do, now we've pinned the bias in place, we're going to stitch, here's my seam allowance, we're going to stitch about a 1/4 inch away, or we will stitch at a 1/4 inch away on each side of that seam allowance. So a 1/4 inch on this side and a 1/4 inch on this side. So let's go ahead and do that. Back to the machine. Alright, we're back at the sewing machine. So now we want to go ahead and stitch on either side of this seam, on both sides. Again, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch away from that seam allowance. I can't see my guidelines on my plate anymore. So what I'm going to do is use my presser foot as a guide. I'll put the edge of my presser foot right against that seam allowance, and then that should bring me a 1/4 inch away. Okay, you want to make sure you're sewing, so we're top stitching, we're sewing through all layers, so the front of our fabric, the seam allowance, and the bias. Okay, want to stitch through all layers. So you need to make sure that your seam allowance is wide enough so that when you stitch, you're catching through all those layers. Okay, I don't want to have to, if I were going to stitch like an inch away from that edge, I wouldn't be catching my seam allowance, and then that would come undone when I open up that seam and open up. Okay, so let's go ahead and stitch this. This is permanent, so we're going to back tack at the beginning and end. At the end of one, back tack right there. Okay, let's go ahead and do the other side now. Again, we'll stitch a 1/4 inch away from that seam. Remember, this is permanent, so we're going to back tack at the beginning and at the end of this row of stitching. Here we go. And there we are. Okay, so it's all been stitched now on both sides. All right, let's go back to the cutting table. All right, we're back. Let's go ahead. I always like to have my bias longer than I need it, so you can see it's. I can trim this back here now, so I don't need it any longer than that. And here. Also, if you want, you can trim it back to match your seam allowance. If you're afraid it's creating too much bulk, you can trim it back too. I'm not worried about that, so I'm going to leave it. And we're going to open up that first seam we sewed as well now. So let's go ahead and just take our seam ripper. And you'll want to pull all those little threads and hairs out. Alright, but now you can see on the inside there is my bias or contrasting fabric, whatever it would be. Okay, so when you put this on, when this is added to a garment or something, it actually pulls open a little bit, and you see it, that hint or that little bit of extra fabric or detail. Okay, so this is a great little detail to put in your seams. Okay, all right, so there it is. That is a slot seam.